Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Ihr Gestirn, Ihr hohen Lüfte, which translates to stars above in myriads shining. Very straightforward chorale today, not too much to write home about. We're just going to hop right into the analysis. So one flat in the key signature, we start on D minor, we end on D major. I reckon we're in the key of D minor, and we spend the majority of our time in the key of D minor. We do visit F for a bit. Actually, do we spend the majority of our time in the key of D minor? I'd say it's about a 50-50 split actually, if not a 60-40 split between D minor and F major. F major comprises the end of the first section and I guess the majority of the second section, where D minor does the opposite. So 50-50, 60-40, somewhere between there. So not a majority situation, or not like a stark majority situation. We start off with our tonic triad, passing tones in the lower voices, and then we have F, A, and D. Just taking that tonic triad, putting it in first inversion, neighbor tone in the bass, and then we get an accented non-chord tone situation here with F sharp, G, C sharp, and E. This F is, like I said, an accented non-chord tone. It's really this E that is the third of our chord, making this C sharp diminished over E. And when we see 1-6 going to 7-6, it's very common for us to see 1 on the other side of it, and that's what we get here. D, A, D, and F. D minor, root position, passing 7th in the bass, another passing tone as well, B flat. Maybe you could call this a 6-7 chord if you looked at this B flat as the root of the chord, but I don't really find that all that necessary. But we do get maybe a little bit of an interesting progression here. We have A, B flat, E, and G. This A is an accented non-chord tone, really is this G right here that is the third of our chord. This would be, not 7. I was thinking in terms of 7 because I was thinking about what I was going to say next, but this is 2-6. And the reason why I said it's 7, or I was about to write 7, is because 2 feels like 7 of 3, just because it is also the leading tone of the 3 in its own respective key, which in this case would be F major, right? And when we see 2 go to 3, it sounds like a dominant tonic progression in the key of F major, but I still think we're in the key of D minor. We've seen this a couple times in the past. F, C, F, and A. 2 going to 3, and it feels like 7 going to 1 and F. That's what I was getting at. Little neighbor tone here in the bass, and then we get F, D, F, and A. I guess technically this is a D minor chord in first version, kind of an unusual chord here, which would make all of these tones, non-chord tones happening off of the harmonic rhythm. Kind of gives us like an A7 vibe a little bit, but we don't have the C sharp in there to really validate what kind of A minor chord, or what type of A chord it is, whether it's A minor or A major. I guess this could also continue to be a 3 chord as well. If we looked at this D as an accented non-chord tone, really the difference between 1, 6, and 3 is D versus C. I mean, I don't really think it's super significant, but all in all, have this idea of F being in the bass for a couple of beats here before we get back to D minor in root position. D, F, A, and D. Just changing the figured bass. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. That's always hard for me to say. And then we end our first phrase with a half cadence. We have A, E, A, and C sharp, and Bach is using this repeated cadential structure. Alright, next phrase ends in the key of F major, but we spend the majority of the phrase in the key of D minor still. So our 5 chord resolves: D, F, A, and D. It's D minor. Passing tone in the bass, and then we get the first inversion D minor chord again with F in the bass, similar to how the previous phrase started. F, F, A, and D. Passing tone bringing us back down in the bass, however, very similar to how we just had our previous phrase start. We get accented non-chord tones on the inner pair of eighth notes in this 4/8 note group. Then we have C sharp, E, A, and E. So not 7-6, but rather 5-6 A major over C sharp, and that takes us to a long sort of D minor pedal here, D, D, A, and F. Then we have this neighbor tone here in the tenor, D again, so we don't need to reanalyze. Then we have E, and we have G, which are both non-chord tones, and then we have D minor again on the third beat of the harmonic rhythm, and then we have a neighbor tone in the alto and a passing tone in the tenor. Now we're looking towards modulating to the key of F major. We have D, B flat, F, and F, which is B flat major over D, which is 6-6. That also happens to be 4-6 in the key of F major. Some non-chord tones on the end of that beat, which leaves us with C, A, F, and F. It's kind of like a passing or off the harmonic rhythm 1-6-4 chord, and that takes us to B flat, D, F, and G. That's G minor 7 over B flat. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords. And then that takes us to 5, C, C, E, and G. And this B is a little delayed passing tone. This G is, it's kind of interesting. Both of these Gs are chord tones. But this one appears like it's happening a little bit later or earlier than one that's happening later. This rhythm right here looks a little confusing to me. Throws my brain for a loop. Maybe I'm going to put a parentheses around these, but maybe this is a 1-6-4-5 progression that's interrupted with the 2-6-5. I don't really think so, but it could be there because the 1-6-4 and the 5 being linked together that way. The resolutions aren't really happening the way that we would expect. I feel like this 1-6-4 chord is really more incidental than anything else, but maybe you could make the argument they are linked together. But our phrase ends with F major. F, A, C, and F. Okay, next phrase ends in an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of F. We start off with C major, C, C, E, and G, which is our 5 chord. Here we have some passing tones in the bass and the alto before we get E, C, G, and G. Are you seeing a pattern with how these phrases are starting by just taking our first chord and inverting it? Then we have F major, F, C, G, and A. G being a 9/8 suspension over the tonic. Very common to see 9/8 suspensions over root position tonic triads here. And then we get kind of a jumbled mess here with a lot of suspensions going on. We have a 4/3 suspension happening over the bass, and we have a 7/6 suspension happening over the bass at the same time. But really what we have is G, B flat, E, and A. So it's kind of an interesting chord. I'm going to say that maybe there's a 7/6 chord going on here, but this A is sort of being held over, and we're just going to say that these are all non-chord tones. But yeah, there's definitely a 7 chord being implied here. This A is being held over. I'm putting it in parentheses actually, and I'll put it down there as secondary analysis because technically the A does not belong in the chord. But it definitely feels like this is a 1 to 1-6 progression. This feels a little bit more intentional than, or intentional is the wrong word there. I think it feels at least a bit more, I guess, deliberate. Intentional, they're the same word, kind of, sort of. What am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say that the chord here feels much more like a chord progression happening across the span of the measure than this right here, if we are comparing the two phrases in terms of their structure, because they do both consist of chords that start by introducing the chord on the 1 of the beat and inverting the chord on the 3 of the beat, but the second beat of the measure, or the 3 of the measure, but the second beat is some type of passing harmony. It does feel like there's a 7 there, and 1 going to 7/6, going to 1/6 presumably, right? Kind of the retrograde of this progression, one of the most common progressions in Bach. A, F, and C. Makes sense for the 7/6 chord to be there, but this A is really just counterpoint, just a sustained tone. And as we're closing in on our cadence, we have G, D, F, and B flat, which is a root position 2-7 chord. And then we get G, D, E, and B flat. And while I think it's possible this could be a 7-6-5 chord, and it'd be kind of interesting to see 2-7 going to 7, because 2 going to 7 is a relatively uncommon progression in Bach. It's usually like a contrapuntal progression, or 2 and 7 are sort of played with one another as the same chord that are made different by this half-step motion here. I think this E is an accented non-chord tone, and really this D is just continuing the idea of G minor. However, we're getting rid of the 7th in the chord, so I'm just going to change the figured bass to reflect root position, root position just triad. That takes us to 5 like we would expect. C, C, E, and G. C major, and then we cadence on F major. F, C, F, and A. And of course that chord is repeated, the last chord in the phrase. And then we see, structurally sort of like a retrograde as well, or not a retrograde, but like the inverse, where we have D minor going to F, and here we have F major going to D minor. And it's like, actually, as far as the structure of this chorale is concerned, the modulation happens in the same metric point of the B section as it does in the A section, at least in the way that I analyze it. This is a bit of a zone. You can say the modulation happens over the span of really any of these chords, but I feel like here over this B flat it makes the most sense to me, so that's why I marked it there. It's not necessarily right or wrong. There isn't one right answer. It's all about perspective. So still analyzing in the key of F, we go to another F major chord. We have F, F, A, and C, so we don't need to reanalyze. We have F here, which is a chord tone, so we don't need to reanalyze. G, which is a passing tone, and then we have A, F, A, and C, which again is sort of like taking the chord and inverting it again. So we could say that this is 6. However, what I think is a little bit more informed and possibly related to what I think is the higher function of what's happening here is this E flat, right? E flat implies that it wants to resolve down to D, which will end up being the third of B flat major. So I think maybe a better analysis would be 5/6 of 4, just because of the fact that we know that this A chord is most likely going to resolve to something with a D in it, and it's most likely going to be B flat, but it could also be G minor. It could be really any chord with a D in it, to be honest, but most likely it would be B flat, and that's how this chord operates, which makes me feel like this analysis is justified. And we see the tonic also functioning as 5 of 4 all over the place in Bach. So here we have our 4 chord, B flat, D, F, and D. Little neighbor tone here as well before we get B flat, D, F, and D. No need to reanalyze. Passing tone here in the alto before we get A, C, A, and F, which is our tonic in first inversion, F major. And then we have G, B flat, and E. So it would be like a 7/6 chord, E diminished over G. And I think this is really, really cool because, again, 1/6, 7/6, what would we expect on the other side of this? We would expect an F major chord, but Bach is using, at least in my opinion, he's using this E diminished chord as the chord that's going to take us back to D minor. So now that it's being contextualized in the key of D minor, we are no longer, I guess, expecting the progression to be fulfilled, because we've seen the progression. This would have been the second time now, or I guess technically the third time if we're including this one here, despite it not being entirely intact. But regardless, 2/6, we would expect it to go to some type of 5 chord, but instead we get an intermediary chord, which is a secondary dominant, G sharp, B, F, and D. And this is a really common little gesture that Bach does here, where I think it's a 7/7 chord, and this E is an anticipation. So this would be 7/7 of 5, G sharp fully diminished 7th. But if you look at this E as the root of the chord, it could be 5-6-5 of 5, and Bach does this with some frequency, actually, this idea of the E being an anticipation to the fifth of the A major that follows it in this case. But yeah, 7-7 of 5, 5-6 of 5, that's fairly nebulous. They're both dominant functioning chords, and they're basically the same chord in terms of their pitch content as well. That takes us to 5, A, E, and C sharp. It's our 5 chord. G is the chordal 7th, but we'll just mark it as a non-chord tone here. And then we cadence at the end of our chorale like we would expect. Perfect authentic cadence, tonic triad, D major, D, A, F sharp, and D. Bach often ends his minor chorales with a major chord. I think it has to do with his relationship with major having a stronger sense of finality, but that's really speculative. I actually don't know whether or not there's like a codifiable reason or something that's been verified by either Bach's own notes or by other scholarship. But that is today's analysis. Really the only thing that's going into my notes is that the tonic is being used as 5 of 4 here, but other than that, everything's straightforward. Really just quaint chorale, easy harmony to analyze. It's a short chorale, and it's also in 3/4, which typically speaking means that the analysis is shorter because each measure has 75% of the content that a chorale of common time usually has. But with all that being said, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Again, thanks for watching the video, and I hope you take care.